Well, hello, I'm Nathan, for those who haven't been before. This last few months, PHP has actually been a bit slow. There hasn't been that much new stuff happening that we haven't already talked about in previous meetups, but there were a couple new features that have been passed and they'll be coming in 8.3. One of them is really interesting. I don't know if anyone actually knows the difference between this, this one, you are adding, this is like a little increment operator. This is the increment operator. This is just like adding to a thing. But you would think intuitively that those do the same thing, but they do not. They mostly do. If you're using it correctly, if you're adding to integers or floats, then it works, you would expect. But as you can see here, if you're adding to null, what happens if you're just adding 1 to null is it actually casts null to 0 and then it adds 1 to 0. So like this addition and subtraction here does like some implicit typecasting between like null and like false goes to 0 and true goes to 1, that sort of thing. But when you increment them, it does like weird and fun behavior. Like if you increment null, it casts it to 0 and then increments it. But if you decrement null, it does nothing. Cool, just as expected. If you increment or decrement a bool, does nothing, regardless. It gets better because if you add, if you're doing addition on like a string, which is numeric, then PHP will cast it to an integer and will increment it or decrement it and give you the integer. However, if you do the increment or decrement on a string, actually, that still works, as long as it's a numeric string. It gets fun when it's a non-numeric string. You can see floats do the same thing. So PHP casts it to a float before it adds or subtracts, same with increment and decrement. But you get fun facts when you have a non-numeric string. So if you try to add 1 to a non-numeric string, you get a type error. If you try to increment a non-numeric string, it finds the last character in the string, and assuming that that character is a valid ASCII character, so not like a foreign non-English character, then it will increment it 1 up in the ASCII table. So like A becomes B, Z becomes capital A. Great. And this gets more fun when you dig in a little bit further. Actually, before I do that, that only happens for increment. Decrement, if you decrement a non-numeric string, it does nothing. Just nothing at all.
So this is a change they've made in 8.3?
No. This is what currently happens. Right, I'm getting to the change. Right. Yeah. Good pickup. This is what currently happens.
8.3 is more of this.
Yeah. Sorry, my title that says PHP 8.3 is kind of a bit misleading there, but this is the lead up. So it gets even more fun. Currently in PHP, if you increment non-numeric string where like Z is the last character, it does when you add to 9 and it becomes 10, so then it carries the 1. You're doing the same thing here. You carry to the to the front. It makes sense, right? Yeah, exactly. And yeah, it does weird stuff, goes to double characters, it's like a whole thing. I went down a pretty big rabbit hole trying to understand this, but there's more. It gets even better because if you add to an empty string, you get a type error. If you increment an empty string, you get the string of 1. If you decrement an empty string, you get the integer 1. Cool. I think that's all right. That's what currently happens. Well, the increment thing, where you're incrementing a non-numeric string, there's actually a curl or peckle thing that is meant to increment strings so that you can do this A becomes B, C becomes D, and that sort of thing. But they only ever implemented it for increment and not for decrement. And then it only works for ASCII characters because it was written by someone in the US, I assume. Doesn't care about any other characters. Yeah, so I don't know why it pretends that an empty string is 1. Couldn't tell you. But in 8.3, so fun fact is that this RFC has come up 3 separate times, and every time it's been like voted down because of like various inconsistencies, but this one got through. And the reason it got through is because they're saying, let's make the increment decrement thing behave exactly the same as if you're like adding and subtracting, right? In previous ones, they've tried to like improve it, like to throw a type error if you increment null, but then it's still inconsistent with like adding 1 to null, which is why like that one got voted down. And the interesting thing about this RFC is it's actually planned for like multiple feature releases. So in 8.3, there's no backwards compatibility breaks. They're adding new functions for string increment and string decrement that you can call to do that like magic, like A becomes B sort of thing if you need to. In the cases where it does nothing, like decrementing null, it emits a warning, but then still just does nothing. But now you get a warning in your logs that you can track down. And then they're deprecating decrementing non-numeric strings, and they're deprecating incrementing non-alpha numeric strings. So if you're like incrementing A, that's not deprecated yet in 8.3. That'll be deprecated in 8.4. That's what this one is. So then like once you get to 8.4, then all these old ways are like deprecated and warnings. And then in version 9, they're going to start doing like actual changes to the behavior. So bool and null will get passed so that they behave the same. They do, where did it go? This, so like bools and nulls will get the proper typecasting so that they don't just do nothing, essentially.
Even that's a code smell. Shame on that.
It's definitely weird, but the idea is to make it consistent. And then you'll be getting type errors for like non-numeric strings as well. So it's like this RFC is like changes for the next like essentially 3 versions coming out, which is very interesting. And I agree, it is kind of a code smell to be like incrementing null, but also it's consistent, so better in some direction.
It's a good time to plug PHP stand.
Yeah.
Static analysis tools, because you should be doing that.
Yeah, so we use like PHP stand and some, and there's like a couple of other ones as well that would like just throw error flags all over the place if you're trying to add to null. Or if something could potentially be null and you're trying to add to it, it'll say, you can't do that because that's stupid. And it's probably right.
And coalesce to something.
Exactly. Null coalesce it to 0, and then you get the explicit typecasting instead of letting PHP juggle it for you. But static analysis is a good segue into the next feature for 8.3, which is the override attribute. Again, I've got a couple slides of like working up to like why you might want this. But when you override a method or when you implement an interface, you don't have any way to express like your intent of like, I'm writing this method and I'm intending it to override something from the parent. So what that can lead to is some weird bugs. Like in this case, we have an interface. It's got a method called isSupported. We've got our class down here and we wanted to implement that interface. But we use a trait to give us like a default implementation of that method. And then, but for this particular implementation, we want to override the method, but we've like typoed it and we've called it isValid because we didn't look at the interface and realize it's actually isSupported. So what happens is like this method just never really gets called in production because everything's calling isSupported on the interface. And you've got this method here that just does nothing because no one's ever calling it. And you've got no way of stopping that. Whereas if you put like an override annotation on this, then you would get an error because that method is not defined in your parent class or your interface or something. And then you would get told immediately that like, you've probably messed up here. This is not what you intended.
Or Copilot did.
Or Copilot did, yeah, exactly. Another time where this might happen is if you just typo something instead of calling it wrong, like you've got your setup method in PHP unit, it's got an extra P there, it's just never going to get called. Whether or not that actually breaks your tests, it probably should, but it might not, and then it slips through, and then your tests aren't really working as you expect them to. Again, an override attribute on that would have caught that because like PHP would be like, oh, there's no setup method that exists that you're overriding. Another interesting one actually is when an interface changes in the future and they remove a method. So then this is like dead code. Like this method used to be defined on this interface, and then for some reason they've gone and like removed the requirement for that method. Symfony does it all the time, where they like change how like some particular pattern works, and then you no longer need all these extra methods. So then you've just got a bunch of dead code lying around. So then if you had an override attribute on here, PHP would give you a fatal error saying it's not overridden, and you could look at that and be like, oh, I don't need that method anymore, and you could just delete it. And the final example I have is an example from Laravel. In Laravel 5.4, they like added a new method, refresh, but there's like a backwards compatibility break there. If people had been defining a refresh method on any of their models that does like a different thing, then you're going to be overriding the refresh method unintentionally, and not kind of like, you're not going to get what you want essentially. And this is an interesting one because the override annotation won't actually help in this scenario, because like previous versions of Laravel, you're not overriding the method, so you wouldn't put the attribute there. But this is where static analysis would come in, because it would realize that, oh, there's a method called refresh on your parent class and you haven't put your override annotation, and it would pop up and be like, hey, should you override this or should you not? And then you can like rename, you can rename the method, or you can put the annotation in, whatever you want to do. So yeah, I've kind of talked about those three ways there, where that annotation kind of allows you to express the intent of what you wanted with the code, and then like static analysis or PHP will tell you that the code's not doing what you intended it to do. There was a couple of questions on the RFC around like why you should have like a keyword, like you could have like public override function or something like that. And the main reason around that is because there's no backwards compatibility breaks by using an attribute, because attributes are like kind of a comment in old versions of PHP and things like that. And then also the keywords are intended to like affect the behavior of the child classes. So if you if you extend a class and now you've got like a public or a protected method or something that like affects the child, whereas your override attribute doesn't really affect the child at all, they would have to specify it themselves if they want to, or not. But yeah, I think it's a pretty cool little addition.
So it's all optional.
It's all optional. You don't have to specify it. It's just if you do put the override attribute there, then at runtime, PHP will assert that that method exists on your parent class and it's got the same type signature. And if it doesn't exist, then you get a fatal error.
And then to your point at the bottom, like you may find that a static analysis tool will force you to do that if there was a collision. So you, in those cases you showed before, you wouldn't accidentally run into those. Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, that's something that, well, personally I would do is, yeah, enforce that every time you're overriding a method. Use static analysis to enforce it. If you're overriding a method, you have to specify that attribute. So then you do catch all these kind of weird bugs that you may not catch otherwise. Is there any questions on those? Those are the only two new features that have come out in the last few months? No? All right, well, there's something else that happened. This Stitcher.io, I don't know if anyone has actually followed his blog, but he posted a lot of stuff about PHP and RFCs and Laravel and all sorts of stuff. But he's gone and created this website to make the PHP RFC process kind of more accessible to people. So you don't have to go onto like the PHP website and like read the RFCs, and then you can also contribute. So it's meant to be like, so you can get a feel for like, does the general community like this feature or not like this feature, and everyone can have their voice heard. But it doesn't really mean anything because these people don't have voting rights in PHP. Potentially it could influence the voters.
Did you try it yet?
I haven't tried it yet, no.
So my understanding of this thing is that after you register, correct me if I'm wrong here, after you register, you can go to any of the RFCs that are listed and say whether you would be for or against it. And if you're against it, you must give the reason why you're against it. And if someone else has already voted against it, and the reason that they gave is exactly what you feel, then you just align with that.
I think you have to give a reason both ways, but yeah.
Both ways, which is incredibly productive, because sometimes you might have an RFC and it gets slammed and nobody tells you, like, there's no constructive feedback. So this is finally like a really good way of getting
that is really interesting, yeah.
of public opinion and hearing fringe considerations, and then so you can actually do another iteration and try to resolve those pain points. It's really smart.
So like, here's the example, like out of all the people who have voted, this RFC has got like pretty decent support amongst the community. And here are the reasons why. Like, here's an argument here where someone's like, this is cool because of X. And like 53 people have said, I agree with that. And that's my reason why I vote yes. And you can come down and you'll see like a reason why I vote no. Like, there's no immediate benefit. And then 16 people have said no to that, like, and agreed with that eventually.
How long has this existed?
Only a couple months, not very long at all.
Fresh.
Yeah.
Really
It is really interesting. So like this pipe operator one, so all of these have actually been voted no, but this pipe operator one is interesting because it only got 11 out of 28 yes votes, like in the actual RFC process. So less than 50% of the actual voters voted in favor of it, but then like the community kind of likes it. It's meant to just like, so you can essentially pipe method calls. So you've got your string and then you pass it into HTML and STs, pass it into string split. It is essentially,
I think it's meant to be like a really concise way of
the
calling all of those,
doing that, yeah.
those functions or methods in a cascading way, and controlling the data types in each level. So sometimes you might have some kind of loose type, and this allows you to specify it.
It's the same as like nesting function calls like this, except it just gives you like a kind of prettier syntax.
I think without having like array filter and array map as being like in JavaScript, there'll be like a dot method on the actual array type itself. Like this would get you a lot further with that like basic map reduce filter sort of stuff.
Yeah,
I find that
the string for like HTML and STs makes me like,
that does make me feel gross as well.
Yeah.
However, with PHP 8.1, you can use this first class callable syntax instead, so it's like less cringy.
But if you've never seen the dots before, you go, what the hell is that? And then spend half an hour trying to Google whatever it's called. I don't experience it.
I also don't know what it's called, so that's fair.
If you don't know what the three dots called, how do you search for three dots?
Yeah. Another interesting one, default methods on an interface, which also got voted down 15 to 32, which does not have support from the community, but it's close. And generally, like, having default methods on an interface is like, interfaces should be light and pure. The other thing about the RFC was it was kind of pitching default methods as a way to get multiple inheritance, and that's like, there's very divided opinions in the community on multiple inheritance. And then essentially just the fact that default methods on an interface is just an abstract class, just use an abstract class, it's fine.
But at the end of the day, even if you get the no vote, even if it gets shot down, at least you get feedback.
You get feedback here.
So good.
Like the general, the only way they discuss these internally is on like the mailing list, and they just like put a thing up that says, let's discuss this please. And sometimes you'll get like no discussion at all, and then it just gets voted down. And other times it just becomes like a flame war for no reason.
Well, you might just get one of the core developers who steps up and goes, I don't like it because 1, 2, 3, and then it just goes silent. Like it's been said, all right,
pretty much.
Step away.
Where it gets interesting though, short closures, which is like arrow functions that we have, but it's, you know how you can't use it for like multi-line arrow functions for reasons. That only this RFC that was meant to make it so you could use it for multi-line arrow functions only just didn't make it through. 2 votes, 27 out of 43. If there were 2 more votes, it would have made it through. And you look at here, and it has got a lot of support in the community, unsurprisingly. And like the main reason why people are saying no to it is that they like that. I don't know if you guys know that the difference closure syntax is determining on whether it's like capturing the scope of the parent. So like your variables get passed through automatically. Whereas with the old closure syntax, you had to use like the use statement and pass in each variable. So if you want 10 of them in there, then you've got like this use statement, which is like forever long, and it's kind of gross, which is why everyone wants arrow functions to do that, because arrow functions automatically capture all your variables from the outside scope, and you can use them inside your function, but you can only have a single line. But yeah. So would encourage you to have a look. Just interesting to see like actual discussion about this, and it's definitely a lot more accessible than the mailing list, which is pretty hard to find what you're looking for. Another fun fact that I found out today when I was writing this talk is the PHP.net, or specifically wiki.php.net, which is where they host the RFCs. Its certificate has expired, and you can't access it anymore. So that's fun.
Oh, you're up.
Yeah.
Hey, it's got HTTP, HSTS, and I can't do anything.
Yes. So HSTS is a fun little header that you can put on that says my site should only ever be served over HTTP, and if it's not, don't allow it. So I don't even have like a I accept this risk continue button on here, unless I go into a incognito mode where I like haven't visited this before, and then Firefox will let me. So now I'm allowed in because I accepted the risk earlier today.
It's got to add it to the preload list, then you're screwed.
Yeah, exactly.